This is one of the most improbable survival stories in the history of polar exploration. A young woman is trapped on a frozen island above the Arctic Circle. Her food is gone, her companions are gone, she has never fired a rifle in her life. Her name is Ada Blackjack. She was 23 years old, a seamstress from Nome, Alaska, hired to sew and cook for 4 men on a scheme to plant a flag on a scrap of frozen land 90 miles off the coast of Siberia. 6 months of supplies, nearly 2 years on the ice, 1 survivor. Chapter 1. The Friendly Arctic. Let's travel back to September of 1921, to a beach in Nome, and follow her all the way to the end. I will mention up front that much of what follows comes from Ada's own diary, held today at Dartmouth's Digital Archives, and from Jennifer Niven's 2003 biography, Ada Blackjack, A True Story of Survival in the Arctic. I'll flag it wherever the record gets murky, because a surprising amount of this story was rewritten by other people after it happened, for their own reasons. We'll get to that. For now, though, I want to take you back further than the ship, back to who Ada Blackjack actually was before any of this began, because I think it's the key to everything that follows. She was born Ada Delatuck in 1898 in a tiny settlement called Spruce Creek, 8 miles outside the village of Solomon and roughly 40 miles from Nome, Alaska. It's a place that no longer exists in any meaningful sense today, one of countless small Iñupiaq communities that thinned out and eventually disappeared over the course of the 20th century. As a child, Ada was sent to a Methodist mission school, the kind that dotted Alaska during this period, where Native children were taught to read the Bible, to sew, to cook, and to run a household the way white missionaries believed a proper household should be run. What she was not taught, and I want you to hold on to this detail because it will matter enormously later, was how to hunt, how to trap, or how to live off the land the way her own Iñupiaq ancestors had for thousands of years before her. Ada grew up capable with a needle and a stove. She grew up, by her own account, afraid of the wilderness that surrounded her on every side. At 16, she married a local dog musher named Jack Blackjack. It was not, by most accounts, a particularly happy marriage. They had 3 children together. 2 died in infancy, a grief so devastatingly ordinary for Alaska Native families of this era that it barely registers as a separate tragedy in most retellings of her story, and I think that alone tells you something about how little attention the world paid to women like Ada before she became briefly, involuntarily famous. In 1921, Jack Blackjack abandoned the family, leaving Ada alone on the Seward Peninsula with her 1 surviving son, a boy named Bennett. What happened next is one of those details that, once you hear it, you can't quite let go of. Ada walked 40 miles to Nome. She carried Bennett on her back when his legs gave out, which, given how young he was, must have been often. When she finally reached the town, exhausted and with almost nothing to her name, she discovered her son had tuberculosis. She had no money for his treatment. She was forced to place him in an orphanage, not because she didn't want him, but because it was the only way anyone could give him medical care. She simply couldn't afford herself. I find this detail almost unbearable, honestly, and I think it's worth sitting with for a second, because everything Ada Blackjack does for the next 2 years traces directly back to the single fact. She needed money, desperately, urgently, to get her son back and get him well. That need is the reason she would eventually say yes to an offer that almost no one else with any real understanding of the Arctic would have accepted. Keep Bennett in mind as we go forward. He is the reason for every single decision Ada makes on Wrangel Island, and he is, quite literally, the last thing she thinks about before she falls asleep most nights out there, according to her own diary. Now, to understand the offer that eventually reached Ada, we need to talk about the man who made it, and his name was Vilhjalmur Stephenson. Stephenson was a Canadian-born explorer and ethnologist, and by 1921, he was one of the most famous and most controversial polar figures alive. 15 years earlier, he had genuinely earned respect living among Inuit communities along the Arctic coast, learning the language, adopting the local diet, and building a reputation as a Westerner who could live in the North on the North's own terms, not fighting it, but working with it. But Stephenson also carried a theory, and it would define and eventually damage the rest of his career. He called it the friendly Arctic. His argument was that the polar regions were not the deadly wasteland popular imagination made them out to be. With the right knowledge, the right attitude, and enough confidence, he believed a person could live off the land almost indefinitely, hunting and fishing their way through even the harshest stretches of winter, the same way an experienced farmer might weather a bad season by living off stored grain and quiet patience. It's important to consider just how much weight Stephenson put on this idea, because it wasn't a passing theory to him. It was closer to a personal mission, something he needed the world to believe as much as he needed to believe it himself. And in 1921, he was about to test it again on 5 people who trusted him completely, most of whom had never met him in person before signing on. I think this is worth pausing on for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the strangest and most undertold parts of this whole saga, and I promise we'll come right back to Ada and Nome in just a minute. Stephenson had tested his friendly Arctic theory once before, and it had gone catastrophically wrong. In 1913, he led the Canadian Arctic expedition aboard a ship called the Karluk. The Karluk became trapped in pack ice north of Alaska, and Stephenson left the vessel with a small hunting party, officially to search for caribou, only days before the ship drifted away from him and was eventually crushed beneath the ice entirely. He never returned to it. The Karluk's crew and scientists left behind under the command of Captain Robert Bartlett endured a horrifying, months-long ordeal, drifting helplessly on the ice before the ship finally gave way beneath them. 11 people died before it was over, including an Inuit woman and 2 small children, some from exposure, some from starvation, 1 shot in a dispute over supplies. The survivors eventually dragged themselves, half dead, onto the shores of an island to wait for rescue. That island was Wrangel Island, the exact same frozen strip of land Ada and 4 young men were about to be dropped onto, 9 years later, under the exact same man's theory about a friendly, forgiving Arctic. You would think a disaster like that would make Stephenson more cautious the second time around. You might expect a man who watched 11 people die testing his own idea to quietly set that idea aside. But no. If anything, Stephenson doubled down, and 2 of the men he recruited for Wrangel Island in 1921 had lived through the Karluk disaster personally. They knew, better than anyone alive, exactly what a bad outcome on this specific island actually looked like up close. They came back anyway. I think that tells you something genuinely strange and worth remembering about the pull Stephenson's ideas had on the people orbiting him, even the ones who'd already paid dearly to test them once. Here's the plan Stephenson eventually settled on for 1921. Send a small party to occupy Wrangel Island and raise a flag there, using that physical occupation to stake a British and Canadian territorial claim. Wrangel Island sat in a strategically interesting stretch of the Chukchi Sea, valuable for fur trapping and walrus hunting, and Stephenson believed it might one day serve as a refueling way station for trans-Arctic aviation, a genuinely forward-thinking idea for 1921, even if the execution around it was reckless in almost every other way. Russia had asserted its own historical claim to the island decades earlier based on prior exploration, but Stephenson believed a fresh, continuous occupation could override that claim under international law. By some accounts, he was also nervously eyeing Japan, worried Japanese interests might attempt to seize the island first if nobody else got there. What's important here, though, and I want you to really absorb this, is that Stephenson never once intended to go himself. He stayed comfortably on the mainland, raised what money he could scrape together from private British and Canadian donors, and handpicked a small team of very young, very inexperienced men to do the actual living, and as it would turn out, the actual dying on his behalf. Let me introduce them properly, because you'll want to know these names. Alan Crawford was a 20-year-old Canadian university student from Toronto, chosen specifically because Stephenson needed a British subject in nominal command in order for any territorial claim to hold legal weight. Crawford was ambitious, well-read, and almost entirely without Arctic experience. Lorne Knight was 28, a Karluk disaster veteran, placed as second in command despite Crawford's official title, because Stephenson privately trusted Knight's hard-earned experience over Crawford's paperwork qualifications. Fred Maurer, also 28, was another Karluk survivor, a quiet, capable man who had, quite literally, buried companions on this exact island once already. And Milton Gala was the youngest of the four at just 19, Stephenson's own personal secretary, a romantic young man who by every account genuinely believed in the friendly Arctic and in the adventure of a lifetime laid out in front of him. None of them, Crawford included, had ever led an expedition of their own, and Stephenson sent all four of them north with only 6 months' worth of supplies, assuring them with total confidence that hunting would easily make up whatever the ship's stores couldn't cover. This is where Ada enters the story, and I think it's worth noting she entered it almost as an afterthought. While outfitting the expedition in Nome that summer, the organizers realized they needed someone who actually knew how to sew and repair skin clothing, real, functional Arctic survival gear, the kind of specialized craft none of the four young men understood in the slightest. They put out word looking for help, and initially, several Alaska Native families expressed real interest, families who had generations of actual hunting and survival knowledge behind them, exactly the kind of expertise this expedition was desperately short on. One by one, as the departure date crept closer and the risks of the voyage became harder to ignore, those families backed out. Ada Blackjack did not. I will note here that Ada herself had entirely reasonable reservations about the whole arrangement. She had been told, before agreeing, that other Native families would be part of the crew, which turned out to be false. She was understandably uneasy about being the only woman and the only indigenous person expected to live in total isolation with 4 strange men for months on end. She had, by several accounts, a genuine and deep fear of polar bears, an entirely rational fear for anyone actually planning to live on an Arctic island. But she was offered $50 a month, an almost unimaginable sum of money for a young Alaska Native woman in 1921, likely more than she had ever been offered for anything in her life up to that point. And on the other side of that money sat her son. So in September of 1921, against what her own instincts were clearly telling her, Ada Blackjack signed on. Before we go any further, I want to pause for just a moment, because I think this channel exists for exactly this kind of story. If you found your way here, and you're the kind of person who likes watching history's forgotten corners get pulled carefully back into the light, sticking around and subscribing genuinely helps more of these get made. And if you want to dig into the primary sources yourself, they're all linked below. Anyway, let's get back to Nome, because a ship is about to leave and it's carrying 5 people and a cat toward one of the strangest, cruelest disasters in the history of Arctic exploration. You see, everyone involved, including Ada herself, seems to have understood, on some level, that this expedition was badly underprepared. Nome in the summer of 1921 was full of quiet, unspoken skepticism about the whole venture. 4 inexperienced young men, 1 untrained seamstress thrown in at the last minute, 6 months of food for what would ultimately stretch into nearly 2 years, and a theory about a friendly Arctic that had already gotten 11 people killed once before. And yet, on September 9, 1921, Ada Blackjack boarded a ship alongside Alan Crawford, Lorne Knight, Fred Moorer, Milton Galla, and a small cat the crew had taken to calling Vic. A week later, on September 16th, they landed on the gravel shore of Wrangel Island, and Alan Crawford planted a British flag in the ground. Nobody watching that flag go up that day could have known it would still be standing, more or less unattended, when the last living member of that landing party was finally found, nearly 2 years later. And that person would not be one of the 4 men who had raised it. Chapter 2: The Ship That Never Came. The island itself was larger and emptier than any of them had been led to expect, roughly 80 miles long and 30 miles wide, treeless, wind-scoured, further from any meaningful rescue than almost anywhere else on the planet. The landscape stretched out flat and pale in every direction, the kind of place where a person could walk for a full day, and the horizon would look exactly the same as when they started. The 5 of them, plus Vic the cat, set up camp near the coast and began the work of preparing for winter. Crawford held the official title of expedition leader, a title that existed mostly on paper for the sake of the territorial claim back home. Knight, older and more experienced, quietly ran the actual day-to-day operations of the camp, and Stephenson had privately instructed Crawford, before they ever left Nome, to defer to Knight's judgment whenever the 2 of them disagreed. The men hunted, tended a small team of sled dogs, and recorded basic meteorological readings for the scientific record Stephenson wanted to bring home to justify the whole enterprise to his donors. Ada cooked, sewed skin clothing for the group, and kept the camp itself functioning, the same kind of domestic labor she had been raised to perform since childhood at the mission school. Let me explain what a single day actually looked like at that camp, because I think it grounds everything that comes later. Morning started early and cold, with someone breaking the ice that had formed overnight in the water buckets. The men split off to check trap lines and hunt along the coast, sometimes gone for hours at a stretch, while Ada worked inside the main tent, mending torn seams and caribou skin trousers, patching mittens, boiling whatever meat had come in the day before into a stew that had to stretch across 5 people and 1 hungry cat. In the evenings, by lamplight, Crawford wrote up the expedition's official log, the document meant to justify all of this to Stephenson's donors back home, while Knight recorded weather readings that, as far as anyone can tell, nobody back in civilization ever found particularly useful. It was, in its early months, almost domestic, almost, you might even say, boring, in the specific way that a well-run camp in a genuinely dangerous place can feel boring right up until the moment it very suddenly isn't. You see, none of this happened in a vacuum either. Even in that first winter, faint tremors of the geopolitical dispute that would eventually shape Ada's entire rescue were already beginning under the surface. Russia had never recognized Stefansson's claim to the island, and Soviet authorities were, from virtually the moment the flag went up, quietly aware that a foreign party was occupying territory they considered their own. Nobody at the camp knew this yet, of course. They were separated from the nearest telegraph by an ocean of ice and had no way of knowing that their small, half-planned adventure was slowly becoming a live diplomatic irritant between 3 governments at once. I mention it now because it will matter enormously later, and because I think there's something almost unbearably ironic about it. The 5 people actually living through this ordeal were, in a very real sense, the last to know it had become an international incident at all. The ship that had carried them north, a small vessel called the Silver Wave, unloaded their 6 months of supplies onto the gravel beach and departed in early October, leaving the 5 of them and Vic formally alone on the island for the first time. I will mention that this is the exact moment the entire venture stopped being theoretical. Up until that point, everything about the expedition had existed on paper: contracts, funding pledges, Stephenson's confident assurances about game and weather. Once the Silver Wave's sails disappeared over the horizon, all of that theory became something the 5 of them would simply have to survive in practice, with whatever they'd managed to bring ashore and whatever the island itself was willing to give up. I will mention here, because it foreshadows something important later on, that the relationship between Ada and the men grew tense almost immediately. Knight's own diary records an incident from that first autumn on the island, when Ada refused, for reasons that go unrecorded, to patch a pair of boots on demand. Knight tied her to the expedition's flagpole and left her there until she agreed to do the work. When that punishment failed to produce quick enough results, the men withheld meals from her as well. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this channel tries hard not to flatten real people into simple heroes and simple villains. Knight, in this specific moment, was not a hero. He was a frightened, isolated 28-year-old man asserting control the only way he apparently knew how, over the single person in camp with less institutional power than himself. Hold on to this incident. I promise you it will come back around later in this story in a way that says something genuinely uncomfortable and complicated about human nature under sustained pressure, and about how quickly cruelty and dependence can end up occupying the exact same relationship. It's worth remembering, too, exactly what Ada had been promised before she ever boarded that ship in Nome, and how little of it turned out to be true. She had been told other Alaska Native families would be part of this expedition, people who shared her language and her background, people who might have made the isolation bearable. Instead, she found herself the only indigenous person and the only woman among 4 strangers who, as this flagpole incident shows, were perfectly willing to use physical restraint and withheld food to get compliance out of her. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Ada Blackjack's very first winter on Wrangel Island was already teaching her a hard lesson about exactly how much protection her contract, her wages, and her employer's promises would actually provide her once she was 3,000 miles from anyone who might hold these men accountable. That lesson would only grow more relevant as the expedition wore on. That first winter, by most accounts, actually passed with a surprising degree of calm. Game was reasonably available along the coastline: foxes, seals, the occasional bear, enough small birds to supplement the group's dwindling canned stores. The 5 of them settled into workable routines. Ada slowly, almost accidentally, began absorbing skills nobody on this expedition had ever planned on teaching her, watching how the men set traps, how they read the ice, how they field-dressed game, filing all of it away without anyone quite realizing how much she was learning. Spring arrived, and with it came seals and walrus in genuine abundance, and for a stretch of weeks that spring, the camp felt almost comfortable, almost like the friendly Arctic Stephenson had promised them might actually be real. The men spent that spring in reasonably good spirits by the tone of their surviving letters. Crawford wrote home about the strange beauty of the place, the way the pack ice groaned and cracked at night like something alive, the endless silver light of the Arctic summer that never quite gave way to full darkness. Knight and Maurer, drawing on their Karluk experience, taught the younger men how to read shifting ice for safe travel, which leads to a void, which floes could bear weight and which couldn't. Ada, for her part, had by now quietly become the camp's best seamstress of actual survival gear, not just decorative sewing, but the kind of tightly stitched, windproof skin clothing that could mean the difference between a productive hunting trip and a fatal one. It's worth noting that nobody in camp seems to have fully acknowledged, even to themselves, how much they had all come to depend on a woman most of them had originally treated as barely more than hired help. You might think, given how this whole ordeal started, that the worst of it was already safely behind them. You might reasonably assume that surviving one full Arctic winter meant the hardest part was over, but no. The real crisis on Wrangel Island hadn't even started yet, and it would begin, of all things, with a ship that simply never arrived. The original plan, as Stephenson had explained it before any of them ever left Nome, called for a resupply vessel to reach Wrangel Island by the summer of 1922, bringing fresh food, mail, replacement gear, and word of the outside world after nearly a year of total isolation. That ship, named the Teddy Bear and captained by a man named Joe Bernard, did in fact set sail that summer, exactly as promised. It never made it through. The pack ice around Wrangel Island that particular year was simply too thick and too extensive for the small vessel to break through, and after weeks of trying, damavis. Teddy Bear was forced to turn back toward Alaska, its cargo of relief supplies still sitting untouched in the hold. On the island, the 5 colonists spent that entire short Arctic summer watching the horizon, scanning the water for a sail that never once appeared. I will note here that this is the exact moment where the entire premise underlying this whole expedition began to genuinely buckle. Stephenson's friendly Arctic theory had always assumed that hunting could fill in whatever gaps planning and logistics inevitably left behind. It had worked, more or less, for one full winter under relatively favorable conditions. Nobody stranded on that island yet had any real sense of what a second consecutive winter with dwindling supplies, no resupply on the horizon, and worsening game would actually cost them before it was through. Before we go any further into how bad things got, I think it's worth pausing on a genuinely fascinating aside, and I promise we'll come right back to the island in just a moment. I mentioned earlier that 2 of these men, Knight and Maurer, were Karluk survivors, and I think it's worth explaining just how strange that particular coincidence really is, because I find it almost impossible to get past once you sit with it. The Karluk disaster ended with its survivors dragging themselves onto the shores of this exact same island 9 years earlier, after 11 of their companions died along the way, some from starvation, some from exposure, one from a violent confrontation over dwindling supplies that still gets debated by historians today. Fred Maurer had personally helped bury people on Wrangel Island once already in his life. He understood, in a way none of the other 3 men quite could, precisely what the worst possible outcome on this island actually looked like, up close, in specific and unforgettable detail. And he came back anyway, older, presumably wiser, and apparently still convinced that Stephenson's theory of a forgiving Arctic was worth staking his life on a second time. Lorne Knight, for his part, had written admiringly about the friendly Arctic in his own personal journals well before this expedition ever began, seemingly untouched by his own experience of watching people starve to death on pack ice less than a decade earlier. Neither man's brush with catastrophe appears to have shaken their underlying faith in the man who kept sending them back out onto the ice. I find that combination of hard experience and unwavering belief genuinely strange and more than a little sad, and I think it says something about how persuasive charismatic theories can be, even to the people who've already personally paid the price of testing them. Anyway, back to 1922, and to a camp that was beginning, quietly, to worry. By that autumn, the mood on Wrangel Island had shifted unmistakably from patient waiting to real, unspoken dread. Supplies that had been meant to be gently stretched with fresh caught game were dwindling fast because the game itself, for reasons the group couldn't fully explain, had grown noticeably scarcer than it had been the previous year. It's worth pausing on something here, because I think it's genuinely easy to lose sight of from a comfortable distance 100 years later. None of these 5 people had any way of knowing whether help was actually coming, or when, or if it ever would at all. There was no radio, no means of contact with the outside world whatsoever. There was only the horizon, watched daily out of habit more than hope by that point, and an increasingly cold, dark second winter closing in around all of them at once. If you've made it this far into the video, this is exactly the kind of long, patient, slow-building unraveling this channel loves digging into, and if that's the kind of thing you enjoy, there's a subscribe button that genuinely helps keep more of these coming. Now let's go back to that second winter, because from here forward things are about to get very, very dark very quickly. Chapter 3, What the Ice Took. By January of 1923, conditions on Wrangel Island had become genuinely desperate. Temperatures hovered near 50 degrees below zero, cold enough that exposed skin could freeze within minutes into every single task. Hauling water, gathering driftwood, checking traps became its own small, exhausting expedition. The last of the group's stored food was nearly gone. The hunting that had sustained all 5 of them comfortably through the first winter had simply dried up, the foxes and seals and birds having either moved on or grown too scarce and too wary to reliably catch. And in the middle of all this, Lorne Knight, the single most experienced Arctic hand among them, began showing the unmistakable early signs of scurvy: swollen, bleeding gums, deep, persistent exhaustion, a slow and frightening weakness that no amount of what little food remained seemed able to reverse. I will mention, since it matters for what's about to happen, exactly what scurvy actually is. It's a disease caused by a prolonged lack of vitamin C, something normally found in fresh fruit, vegetables, and, importantly for the Arctic, in fresh raw meat and organ meat as well. Sailors and explorers had been dying of it for centuries, long before anyone understood the cause, and it kills slowly from the inside out by breaking down the body's connective tissue bit by bit. Left untreated, it is entirely fatal. Ironically, the cure was sitting all around them, in fresh seal and fox meat, if only enough of it could still be caught. Faced with a starving camp and a functional leader who could no longer reliably stand, let alone hunt, Crawford, Maurer, and Gala reached a decision together. They would take the group's remaining sled dogs and the bulk of what supplies were left and attempt to cross the frozen sea to Siberia, roughly 90 miles of shifting, unstable pack ice, in the hope of finding help, or at the very least, food, before it was too late for everyone. It's worth pausing on how genuinely desperate a plan this actually was. 90 miles of drifting sea ice in the dead of an Arctic winter, with no guarantee the ice would even hold together as a continuous path the entire way, was already a serious gamble for 3 healthy, well-supplied men. Crawford, Maurer, and Gala were neither. They were malnourished, worn down by more than a year of hard rationing, and equipped with whatever gear the camp could spare without leaving Ada and Knight with nothing at all, but the alternative, staying put and simply watching the food run out entirely, offered no better odds and arguably worse ones for everyone involved. On January 28, 1923, the 3 of them packed the sled, said their goodbyes, and set out across the ice, leaving Ada Blackjack behind to care for Knight, who by then could barely lift himself from his sleeping bag without assistance. They were never seen again. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment because it sits at the true, unresolved center of this entire story. Nobody knows, even now, exactly what happened to Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gall out there on the ice. No bodies were ever recovered. no wreckage, no abandoned gear, no scrap of clothing, nothing. The sea ice covering the Chukchi Sea in the depths of January is notoriously unstable, prone to sudden invisible leads of open freezing water splitting apart beneath a traveler's feet with almost no warning, and prone to entire sheets breaking loose from the mainland pack and drifting silently out into open ocean, carrying anyone unlucky enough to be standing on them along with it. It's possible the three men drowned quickly. It's possible they froze slowly, sheltering as best they could against wind with no fuel left to burn. It's possible the ice simply carried them out to sea, alive, adrift for days before the cold or the water finally finished what the crossing itself had started. We will very likely never know which of these is closest to the truth, and I think that unresolved absence is, in its own quiet way, just as haunting as anything that happens to the two people left behind on the island. In the years that followed, various search efforts and inquiries tried to piece together what might have happened. Some speculated the three men had actually made it across most of the ice and drowned in open water close to the Siberian coast, tantalizingly near safety. Others suggested they may have run into a Soviet patrol and been detained or killed without any record surviving on the Russian side, a theory that gained a little more traction given how tense the diplomatic situation around the island was becoming at almost the exact same time. Neither theory has ever been confirmed. No Soviet records naming them have ever surfaced. No remains have ever washed ashore. As far as the historical record is concerned, three young men walked out onto the ice in January of 1923, and the ice simply closed back over the question of what happened to them, permanently. Keep that open question sitting in the back of your mind as we go forward. We're going to come back to it much later than you might expect, at the exact moment Ada finally learns the truth, or at least as close to the truth as anyone would ever manage to get. For weeks after they left, Ada kept a kind of quiet vigil. She has no way of knowing whether the three men were still walking, whether they'd found a Siberian village, whether help was already on its way back toward the island. Her diary from this stretch, once it begins in March, is full of small, understated notations that read almost like a held breath: weather conditions, whether the traps held anything or not, how night was doing that particular day. There's no dramatic language in it, no despair spelled out in so many words, just the daily discipline of surviving one more day, and somewhere underneath that discipline, an unspoken hope that the horizon might at any moment produce three familiar figures walking back toward camp instead of away from it. More than once during those long weeks, that hope very nearly seemed to pay off. A dark shape out on the ice, far in the distance, would resolve itself, on closer inspection through the field glasses, into nothing more than a shadow cast by shifting pressure ridges, or a seal hauled out to rest, or simply a trick of the flat Arctic light playing across uneven snow. Each time, for a moment, Ada would let herself hope. Each time, the shape would fail to move, or would turn and lope away on four legs instead of two, and the hope would have to be quietly folded back up and set aside for another day. You might think that after enough of these false alarms, she would have simply stopped looking. She never did stop. She kept watching the horizon deep into the summer, long after any reasonable person might have concluded it was pointless. Back at camp, Ada Blackjack was now, for the very first time in her entire life, entirely and solely responsible for her own survival and for the survival of a man who could no longer do anything to help her. Let me explain what that actually meant in practical, day-to-day terms, because I think it's easy to skate past the sheer scale of what she took on almost overnight. Ada had come to Wrangel Island 17 months earlier as a seamstress and a cook, someone hired specifically because she could sew and mend, not because anyone expected her to hunt, trap, or defend a camp. She had no meaningful hunting experience of her own. She was, by her own admission, genuinely terrified of firearms, and now, in the coldest, hungriest stretch of an already brutal winter, she was the only functioning adult on an entire Arctic island, expected to hunt, trap, gather firewood, defend the shelter from curious and increasingly hungry polar bears, and nurse a dying man through the night, all at once, entirely alone, with no one left to ask for help or advice. Temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, to check trap lines strung out across a mile or more of frozen coastline, resetting the ones that had been sprung by wind rather than by an animal, resetting the ones that had actually caught something and needed to be reset entirely from scratch. Back to camp to skin and process whatever she'd caught, then out again for driftwood, because a fire that went cold in that kind of weather could kill a bedridden man within hours. Somewhere in between all of that, she cooked, fed Knight by hand when he was too weak to hold a spoon himself, changed and washed what needed changing and washing, and still found time, most days, to write a few short, unadorned lines in the notebook that would eventually become the only unfiltered record of any of this. It's important to consider that she did every part of this alone, with no one to spell her for even an hour, for months on end, while also fighting off the early symptoms of the same disease that was killing the man she was caring for. Now, here's where I think this story earns its real complexity, and where I want to be honest with you rather than offer you a simpler, cleaner, more comfortable version of events, because Lorne Knight, the man Ada was now solely and entirely responsible for keeping alive, did not become gentler or easier to care for as he grew sicker. If anything, he became crueler. As the scurvy progressed and his own helplessness deepened, Knight began lashing out at Ada verbally, blaming her for his worsening condition, accusing her of not hunting hard enough on his behalf, of not caring for him properly, of essentially, in his sicker and angrier moments, trying to starve him deliberately. According to accounts drawing on Knight's own diary, he told her, at his lowest and most bitter, that it was no real surprise her husband had abandoned her, and no surprise at all that 2 of her own children had died, as though her life's worst private tragedies were simply further proof of some personal failing on her part. I want to be careful here, and I think it's important to say so directly, because Knight's diary is also, as we'll see very shortly, the exact document a man named Harold Noyce would later twist and selectively edit to attack Ada publicly. So we should hold the specifics of Knight's accusations with some real caution. We're relying in part on the private words of a frightened, dying man, later filtered through someone with an agenda of his own. But multiple independent accounts agree on the broad shape of what happened here, even setting Noyce's later manipulations aside entirely. A dying, terrified man took his own fear and helplessness out on the one person actively keeping him alive, and at least one account describes a moment where his frustration turned physical when he reportedly attempted to strike her during one of these episodes, weak as he by then was. Try to sit with the strangeness of that relationship for a second. This was a man who, less than 2 years earlier, had tied Ada to a flagpole for refusing an order. Now he was entirely dependent on her for every meal, every change of bedding, every reason he was still breathing at all, and his response to that dependence, more often than not, was to lash out at the one hand still willing to feed him. There was one stretch in early spring that briefly promised something better. The ice began breaking up along the shoreline earlier than expected, and with it came a run of seals thick enough that Ada, for a few days, actually managed to build up a small surplus of meat rather than simply hunting for that day's meal alone. She wrote about it almost giddily, by the standards of her usual understated entries, cautiously allowing herself to hope that maybe, with enough of a stockpile, both she and Knight could hold on until real help arrived. Then a hard freeze rolled back in, The seals vanished from the open leads as quickly as they'd appeared, and the surplus, modest as it was, dwindled back down within a couple of weeks. It's a small, almost forgettable cycle in the grand shape of this story: danger, then a flicker of real hope, then a quiet setback. But it happened to her, in one form or another, more times than I can comfortably count across those final months, and I think each repetition cost her something that never fully got restored. And here, I think, is the part that's genuinely, uncomfortably human, and it's worth pausing on, because it's the exact moment where Ada Blackjack stops being a flawless, saintly survivor in this story and becomes instead a real, complicated person. Because despite everything Knight said to her, in his worst moments, Ada kept feeding him. She kept nursing him. She kept giving him the better share of whatever meat she managed to trap or shoot, even as her own body, quietly and without complaint in the record, began showing its own early signs of scurvy. But she did not do any of this with a pure, uncomplicated heart, and to her enormous credit, she never once pretended otherwise in her own private words, meant for no one's eyes but her own. In her diary, unfiltered and unguarded, she wrote about the sheer unfairness of her situation in language that still stings a full century later. He never stop and think how much it's hard for women to take foreman's place, to woodwork and to hunt for something to eat for him, and do wading to his bed and take the she-ad out for him. It's important to consider what that sentence actually contains. It isn't quiet gratitude. It isn't saintly, uncomplaining endurance. It's genuine, unfiltered resentment from a woman doing absolutely everything humanly possible for a man who is actively making that effort harder with his own cruelty, on top of everything else already stacked against her. She kept caring for him anyway, but she was allowed to be furious about it while she did, and in the privacy of her own notebook, she absolutely was. I think that combination, the relentless caretaking held together with the raw, private resentment, is more honest and frankly more admirable than any flattering, simplified myth could ever manage to be. This is the moment, I think, where you understand fully that Ada Blackjack was never a saint. She was something better and something more useful for the rest of us to actually learn from. She was a real person, doing an impossible thing, without ever once pretending it didn't cost her something enormous to do it. I should mention, too, what was actually holding her together underneath all of it, because it's the same thread running through this entire story from the very first page. It was Bennett. In one diary entry from April of 1923, prepared, it seems, in case she didn't make it off that island alive, Ada wrote out something close to a final instruction. If anything happened to me and my death is known, there is black stirp for Bennett's schoolbook bag, for my only son. I wish, if you please, take everything to Bennett that has belonged to me. It's a plain, almost businesslike little passage, a mother making sure her son gets a bag she'd made for him, even if she never comes home to give it to him herself. I find it quietly devastating, and I think it explains, better than almost anything else in the historical record, exactly where Ada found the will to keep going through everything Wrangel Island threw at her. She said much the same thing to a reporter after her rescue, admitting plainly that she doubted she could have pulled through at all if it hadn't been for thoughts of her little boy waiting for her back home. Before we continue, there's one more detail from this period I want to handle with care, because I think it deserves that, and I don't want to rush past it, and because it also tells you something important about how carefully we need to read every single source in this story. Earlier in the expedition, according to accounts drawing on Knight's own journal, Ada went through a stretch of severe psychological distress, isolated and afraid of the men around her, and reportedly consumed by such deep despair at one point that she walked away from camp carrying a bottle of liniment, apparently considering it as a way out of her suffering entirely. She did not go through with it. I bring this up not to dwell on it, and I'm not going to describe it in any more detail than that, but because I think it would be dishonest of me to tell you a story about extreme isolation and sustained cruelty without also acknowledging plainly what that isolation actually did to the person living through it, day after day, with no one else to turn to. I will mention, too, that this same stretch of Knight's journal also describes Ada as fixated on Crawford, supposedly declaring she would die for him. It's important to consider the source here before taking that claim at face value. This is the exact diary that Harold Noyce would later selectively edit and use to publicly smear Ada's character, tearing out the pages that made her look sympathetic while keeping the ones that didn't. That doesn't mean every line Knight wrote was false. It means a diary, written by a man who, by his own account, physically restrained Ada and withheld her food earlier that same season, is not a neutral witness to her state of mind, and it deserves to be read with real skepticism rather than repeated as settled fact. What isn't in dispute, from multiple independent accounts, is the underlying toll of what she was living through. Ada Blackjack survived nearly 2 years on that island, and part of what she survived more than once was her own despair, well before the physical crisis of that final winter even reached its worst point. If anything in that touches something close to home for you personally, it's genuinely worth talking to someone you trust, or a professional, and I'm always glad to help point toward resources if that would be useful to you. Let's take stock of where things stood by the spring and early summer of 1923. Knight, fully bedridden by now, was fading visibly by the week. Ada, herself now showing early signs of scurvy, was somehow still managing to keep both of them alive on birds, foxes, and whatever else she could pull from beneath the thinning snow. She devised small comforts wherever she possibly could, rigging a rotating bed made from an old oatmeal sack to help prevent bed sores from forming on Knight's increasingly wasted body, a small, quiet kindness extended toward a man who, on his worst days, showed her none in return. There were good days mixed in with the bad ones, and I think that's part of what made this stretch so exhausting for Ada in particular. Scurvy doesn't progress in a straight line. Some mornings, Knight would seem a little steadier, able to sit up, able to talk without the same edge of desperation in his voice, and on those mornings, by every reasonable account of how hope works, Ada would allow herself to wonder whether he might actually recover, whether the extra rest and the fresh meat she kept bringing in might be turning things around after all. Then his gums would start bleeding again. His legs would swell. The small steadiness of the day before would evaporate entirely, and she would be back to feeding him by hand and changing his bedding and wondering, in the parts of her diary she allowed herself to wonder in at all, how many more of these cycles either of them actually had left in them. You might think, given the sheer scale of what Ada was doing to keep him alive, that Knight would eventually pull through. You might reasonably assume that 2 years of relentless effort would, at the very least, be rewarded with that much. But no, on June 23, 1923, Lorne Knight died, in the same tent he and Ada had shared, for better and very often for worse, through nearly 6 months of illness. The diary entry recording, it is almost eerie in its restraint. There's no outpouring of grief on the page, no long reckoning with what had just happened. Just a short, practical note about moving to a different tent, washing dishes, gathering wood, the same kind of entry she might have written on any other day of that entire ordeal. I don't think that restraint means she felt nothing. I think it means she had, by that point, been living so close to the edge of her own endurance for so long that there was simply no spare capacity left over for grief to fully land, not yet, not with her own survival still entirely undecided. Ada was far too weak by then to bury Knight properly, or to bury him at all in any conventional sense. Instead, she stacked packing boxes around his body inside the tent they had shared for months and quietly moved herself into a different, smaller shelter nearby. She recorded his death using a portable typewriter one of the men had left behind on the island, and then, for the first time in nearly 2 years, Ada Blackjack was completely, totally alone, save for the continued company of a small cat named Vic. I want to pause here on something, because I think it's one of the most genuinely remarkable turns in this entire story. You would reasonably expect this to be the exact point where Ada finally broke after everything that had already happened to her. Instead, by nearly every account we have, something in her steadied instead. Freed from the daily grinding demands of nursing a man who had resented her even as she saved his life, and freed from having to defer constantly to men who had never fully respected her own skills or judgment, Ada seems to have found a strange, hard-won clarity in her total solitude. She hunted more effectively than she ever had with 4 other people watching over her shoulder. She trapped foxes steadily, both for food and for their fur. She built driftwood traps and further reinforced her shelter against the bears that continued to wander uncomfortably close to camp on a regular basis. In one diary entry from this period, dated the 4th of July, she describes calmly stalking and hunting a seal near camp, then pausing afterward to simply note the date and remark on the holiday to herself, a small, almost cheerful moment of ordinary human life persisting stubbornly inside an otherwise unimaginable ordeal. In another entry, she describes fending off 2 separate bears that had approached her shelter, firing warning shots over their heads until both finally turned and fled for good. It's a small scene in the grand scope of everything, but I love it because it's the exact moment this once frightened seamstress, a woman who had never so much as touched a firearm before this expedition began, becomes functionally and undeniably the single most capable person who had ever lived at that camp. She was, by that point in the summer of 1923, simply the only one left alive to prove it. I don't want to skip past Vic in all of this either, because I think the cat mattered more than a passing mention usually gives him credit for. Through every single stage of this ordeal, from the flag raising in 1921 through Knight's death and everything after, Vic stayed with the camp and eventually stayed with Ada alone. In a situation defined almost entirely by human cruelty, both the men's toward her and, in its own way, the Arctic's toward all of them, Vic was simple, uncomplicated company. He didn't accuse her of anything. He didn't need nursing beyond the occasional shared scrap of meat. He was just there, warm and alive, in a world that had otherwise stripped away nearly every other form of companionship she had. It's a small thing, in the scale of everything else happening on that island, but I think it's worth remembering that even total isolation rarely means total solitude, and that sometimes the smallest available comfort is the one that ends up mattering most. I should also mention what all of this was doing to Ada's own body during this stretch, because it's easy to focus entirely on Knight's decline and forget that she was fighting the exact same disease at the same time, with far less rest and far more physical labor demanded of her every single day. Her gums had begun to bleed. Her joints ached constantly. She was, by her own account, exhausted in a way that went beyond ordinary tiredness, the specific bone-deep exhaustion that comes from a body slowly running out of the nutrients it needs to repair itself. And she kept working anyway, because there was no one left to do it if she didn't. I have to say, this is one of my favorite parts of the entire story to sit with, and I think it's worth slowing down for. The Iñupiaq she built Small skin-covered boats stretched over a driftwood frame were not simple things to construct even for an experienced boat builder, and Ada had never built one in her life before this island forced her to. She had to work out the stitching pattern that would keep the skin watertight, the exact tension needed in the frame lashings to survive contact with sea ice, all of it through trial, error, and the kind of stubborn persistence that doesn't show up cleanly in any single diary entry, but that you can trace across dozens of small, unglamorous notes about mending this, restitching that, trying again the next day. What's important here is that none of this came naturally to her. She wasn't some hidden expert revealing a secret talent. She was a frightened seamstress who had never wanted to be anywhere near this island in the first place, teaching herself an entire body of specialized Arctic survival craft from nothing but necessity, under conditions that would have broken most people within the first few months. I genuinely don't think I can overstate how remarkable that is. Here's the detail that I think really drives home just how far Ada had come by this point, and it's one that doesn't always make it into shorter retellings of the story. With no ship in sight and no way of knowing whether one was ever actually coming, Ada didn't simply hunker down and wait to be found. She began, methodically, preparing to survive an entire third winter alone on that island, exactly as if rescue might never arrive at all. She stockpiled fox furs. She stretched and dried meat for storage. She kept the shelter reinforced against the wind and kept her firewood supply steady, because the version of Ada Blackjack sitting on Wrangel Island in July of 1923 had stopped waiting for someone else to save her. She had, through nothing but necessity and sheer stubborn will, become entirely capable of saving herself, indefinitely, if that was what it took. I want to draw a line here back to something we talked about at the very start of the story, because I think it's genuinely worth noticing. Stephenson had built an entire career and staked 4 other lives on the theory that the Arctic was fundamentally friendly to anyone with the right knowledge and the right attitude. By the summer of 1923, that theory had gotten 1 man killed on this exact island 9 years earlier, and had now gotten 3 more men lost without a trace, and 1 more slowly starved to death in a tent. The only person who actually proved any version of Stephenson's theory correct was the one person he'd never trained for it, never expected much from, and never once credited for it afterward. Ada Blackjack didn't survive because the Arctic turned out to be friendly. She survived because she refused to stop learning, adapting and working every single day, long after every reasonable justification for hope had quietly run out. If you've stuck with the story this far, thank you, genuinely, and if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the next stretch is where everything finally comes to a head. Now, before we move into that final stretch, I want to circle back briefly to something we haven't fully resolved yet. Ada didn't know it, alone on that island through the summer of 1923, but back on the mainland, her fate had become tangled up in something considerably bigger than one expedition or even one island. When word reached the outside world that a resupply ship still hadn't managed to reach Wrangel Island, and that the colonists' situation was almost certainly dire by now, the Soviet government, which had never once recognized Stephenson's original claim to the island in the first place, announced its intention to send its own vessel north to remove what it called the foreign interlopers and formally assert Russian sovereignty over the territory. The British government, hearing this, reportedly characterized the threat as something close to an outright act of war, a genuinely striking overreaction to a dispute over a barely inhabited stretch of Arctic gravel. It's worth pausing on how strange this whole diplomatic tangle actually was. The United States government, when formally asked, wanted nothing to do with the dispute at all. Britain's own Foreign Office spent months quietly passing the question back and forth to Canada and the Colonial Office, unable to decide whether they even wanted to back Stephenson's claim in the first place, let alone risk a genuine confrontation with Moscow over it. Stephenson, meanwhile, was privately desperate for anyone, to fund a relief expedition, both to save the people he'd sent north and to salvage his own credibility if the whole venture ended in public disaster. That sudden diplomatic panic, strange as it sounds from a century's distance, is part of what finally shook loose the private funding needed to mount a real rescue attempt. Wealthy British donors, including, according to some accounts, a descendant of the doomed Arctic explorer Sir John Franklin, whose own disappearance nearly 80 years earlier still haunted the British public imagination and had itself spawned decades of costly, fruitless search expeditions, contributed the money needed to charter a rescue vessel called the Donaldson, placed under the command of a man named Harold Noyce. I find it almost unbearably ironic, honestly, that the money finally arrived not because 5 stranded people mattered enough on their own, but because a stretch of frozen gravel had become a matter of national pride for 2 governments who otherwise couldn't agree on anything regarding it. Ada Blackjack, alone on that island stockpiling furs for a 3rd winter she assumed she'd have to survive by herself, had no idea any of this was happening. As far as she knew, in July of 1923, she was entirely forgotten, a footnote in a colonization scheme nobody back home was even thinking about anymore. She was wrong about that, though not in the way you might hope. She wasn't forgotten. She had simply become useful to men fighting over a flag in ways she wouldn't fully understand until she was already back on dry land. We will meet Noyce properly in just a moment, and I want to warn you now, he is not going to be a comforting presence in this story. If anything, what he does next is arguably crueler in its own quieter way than anything the Arctic itself managed to inflict on Ada Blackjack. Chapter 4. The Fog Lifts. August 19th, 1923. Fog everywhere. Thick, gray. Impossible to see more than a few yards through. Ada wakes to a sound outside her tent. She grabs her field glasses. Runs. Her legs are weak from scurvy, from nearly 2 years of half rations and worse, but she runs anyway, because some sounds a person simply cannot ignore. The fog lifts just slightly, just for a moment, a shape out on the water, a ship. For one single suspended heartbeat, she lets herself believe. Crawford, Maurer, Gala, maybe all 3 of them somehow, walking back out of the ice they vanished into 7 long months earlier, coming home at last, exactly the way she had hoped, quietly, every single day since January. She splashes straight into the freezing water, toward the boat. A man climbs down, not one of them, a stranger, Harold Noyce, sent north by Stephenson to finally learn what had become of his colony. 2 words, that's all it takes. He asks where the others are. She asks him the very same question, right back. In that instant, standing together on a beach thick with fog, both of them understand the full shape of the disaster at once, without either one needing to say another word. The 3 men are gone, truly gone, not delayed by weather, not held up along the way, gone, and never coming home again. And on some buried level, Ada has known this for months already, but hearing it finally confirmed out loud, in a total stranger's voice, breaks something open in her anyway, all at once, after 2 years of holding it together on her own. She collapses into his arms and cries. By the time Noyce's crew got a proper look at her, the physical toll of everything she'd survived was plain to see. She was gaunt, her gums still showing the marks of her own untreated scurvy, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had been steadily starved for the better part of 2 years. And yet, she was standing. She had walked down to that beach under her own power, in a caribou skin dress she had sewn herself, and by more than one account, she managed something close to a smile, even in the middle of learning the worst news of her life. I think this is the single moment the entire story has been quietly building toward since that flag first went up in September of 1921, and I want to sit with it before we move forward. This is where the open question we've been carrying since January finally, brutally resolves itself. Crawford, Maurer, and Gala did not survive their crossing. No trace of any of them was ever recovered, not then, not in the decades of searching and speculation that followed. Whatever happened to them out there on the ice, the sea, the cold, or something faster and crueler than either, took the full answer with it, and that answer is gone now, permanently, forever. Ada Blackjack is alive. She, and only she, is the one who made it. What followed was strange in its own quiet way. Noyce and his crew went ashore to see the camp for themselves, the packing boxes stacked around Knight's body, the driftwood reinforced tent walls, the observation platform Ada had built with her own hands to watch for bears. By multiple accounts, Noyce was visibly stunned by what he found, by the sheer scale of what one untrained young woman had managed to keep functioning, alone, for 2 months, with no idea whether anyone was ever coming for her at all. Ada gathered what few possessions she still had. She made sure Vic came aboard safely, and on August 20th, 1923, she left Wrangel Island for the last time, sailing away from the frozen strip of land where 4 people she had crossed an ocean with never got the chance to leave at all. Now, you might reasonably think that after 2 full years of unimaginable suffering, rescue is where a story like this finally ends, quietly, with well-earned relief. But no, in some genuinely important ways, the cruelest part of Ada's entire story hasn't even started yet. Noyce brought Ada back to Nome, along with the cat Vic, and along with something else entirely. The personal diaries and correspondence of the 4 men she had shared this whole ordeal with, Knight's included. Whether Noyce collected these documents simply to pass them along to grieving families back home, or because he had already recognized, even standing on that beach, the commercial value of the story he was suddenly sitting on, remains genuinely unclear to historians, and I think it's fair to hold both possibilities in mind at once, rather than settling on the simpler, more damning version just because it fits the rest of what he did afterward. What is clear, unfortunately, is exactly what happened next. When the Donaldson finally reached Nome, Ada Blackjack, who had spent 2 years desperately trying to avoid attention of any kind, found herself thrust into exactly the kind of spotlight she had never wanted. Newspapers across the country picked up the story almost immediately. A lone woman surviving alone in the Arctic made for irresistible copy, and reporters coined the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life, the female Robinson Crusoe. At first, that attention leaned admiring. She was treated briefly as a genuine hero, a symbol of quiet, unglamorous endurance in an era that liked its explorers loud and its heroes male. Ada wanted nothing whatsoever to do with any of it. She had one single goal, and it had not changed once in nearly 2 years: get back to her son. She gave almost no interviews and spoke publicly about her ordeal exactly once to the Los Angeles Times in 1924, in an interview where she described, plainly and without embellishment, how she had kept trying to save Lorne Knight for as long as there was anything left to try, and how she had been entirely alone once he was gone. Harold Noyce had no such restraint. He went on to orchestrate what one historian later called a genuine worldwide media campaign, and in his version of the story, the one that reached newspapers across multiple continents, Ada Blackjack was not the resourceful, self-taught survivor who had kept 2 separate people alive against genuinely impossible odds. In Noyce's telling, released to the press not long after the initial wave of admiring coverage, she was the villain. Let me explain exactly what that looked like in practice, because I think the specifics here matter enormously. Newspaper stories quoting Noyce directly claim that Ada had refused to help Lorne Knight as he lay dying, and further suggested she had likely saved her own life on food and resources that could otherwise have saved his. This claim, directly and provably, contradicted Knight's own diary, the very diary Noyce himself had personally carried off the island, a diary that documented, in Knight's own handwriting, Ada faithfully nursing him for 6 consecutive months. According to multiple historical accounts, Noyce simply tore the most sympathetic pages out of that journal before allowing anyone else to see it, removing the exact evidence that would have immediately disproven his own story. Rumors spread even further and even more grotesquely than that from there. Some accused her, absurdly and with no evidence whatsoever, of having cannibalized her own companions. The press that had briefly, breathlessly dubbed her the female Robinson Crusoe now also, often in the very same articles, treated her simultaneously as a suspect in the deaths of the very men she had spent 2 years desperately trying to keep alive. It's worth pausing on just how whiplash-inducing that must have been for Ada personally to step off a rescue ship still recovering from scurvy, only to discover that half the country wanted to celebrate her and the other half wanted to put her on trial, sometimes within the very same week, sometimes in the very same newspaper. Stephenson, for his part, showed remarkably little public reckoning with any of it. He continued defending the scientific and territorial value of the expedition even after 4 of the 5 people he had sent north never came home or barely survived, framing the losses as an unfortunate but ultimately worthwhile cost of genuine exploration. I find that framing almost breathtaking in its detachment, honestly, coming from a man who had never once risked his own life on the theory he kept sending other people out to test. It's important to consider just how thoroughly this campaign actually worked, and for how long it was allowed to stand unchallenged. Ada herself, true to form, never publicly fought back against any of it. She simply stayed quiet, focused on Bennett, and let the accusations circulate without comment. It fell to other people, examining Knight's surviving diary pages against Noyce's public claims, to eventually force the contradiction into the open, and Noyce's claims were, in time, publicly retracted. But a retraction rarely travels anywhere near as far, or as fast, or reaches anywhere near as many of the same readers as the original accusation did, and the damage done to Ada's reputation and to the honest historical record surrounding her lingered for decades afterward, largely unrepaired. Newspapers that had run Noyce's version of events on their front pages ran the correction, if they ran it at all, in a fraction of the space buried well past the pages anyone actually remembered reading. What's worse, and this I think is really the crux of everything I want you to sit with here, is what happened financially in the years that followed. Stephenson wrote his own account of the entire expedition, published in 1925 under the title The Adventure of Wrangel Island, a book that made him a meaningful amount of money and further cemented his public reputation as a visionary Arctic thinker, all despite the fact that he had personally never once set foot on the island himself and had sent 4 young men and 1 young woman north to pay the actual price of his theory in his place. Ada received nothing from that book. She received, directly from Stephenson himself, less money than he had originally promised her for her actual labor and survival on the expedition, and by the accounts we have, she accepted the reduced sum without protest, not because she thought it was fair, but because she still, above everything else, needed to get back to Bennett, and a fight over money was a fight she couldn't afford to have while her son was still waiting for treatment. She never saw a single cent from the newspaper stories built on the back of her own survival, nor from any of the books, articles, and retellings that followed in the years and decades afterward, this one very much included, in the sense that we're all standing today on the shoulders of archival research Ada herself was never once compensated to help produce. Before we move into what happened to everyone in the years after, I want to be clear about something. None of what follows undoes any of this. Ada Blackjack never got her full wages. She never got a share of anyone's book profits. She never got a public apology from the two men who profited most directly off her survival. What she got, eventually, decades later, was something smaller and, in its own way, more lasting. The truth, carefully reconstructed by researchers who took her own diary seriously as a historical document rather than dismissing it as the unreliable account of an uneducated native woman, which is exactly how it was treated by more than one of her contemporaries. I will note here plainly, because I think it genuinely deserves to be said without any softening, two men built real careers and real income directly off Ada Blackjack's suffering, while one of them was simultaneously working hard to convince the public she was untrustworthy at best and a killer at worst. She got a partial paycheck and a smear campaign. That is not a fair trade by any reasonable measure, and no honest version of this story can pretend otherwise. What's important here, I think, is that this wasn't an isolated cruelty, a single bad man doing one bad thing. It's a genuinely recognizable pattern, one that shows up again and again wherever an indigenous woman's labor and survival skill end up saving a story that white men then get to tell, publish, and profit from on her behalf. Ada wasn't written out of her own story by accident. She was written out of it by two specific men making specific choices for specific financial and reputational reasons, and it worked for decades precisely because almost nobody outside her own family was positioned to push back on their version of events. I think it's worth asking, honestly, what it would have cost Stephenson to simply pay Ada what he'd originally promised her, or to publicly credit her survival skills instead of letting Noyce's version of events stand unchallenged in the papers for as long as it did. It would have cost him very little relative to the money his own book eventually earned him. He chose not to anyway, and I don't think that choice requires any particularly complicated psychological explanation. It's simply easier and cheaper to let a story about a brave, resourceful indigenous woman quietly become a story about an unreliable, possibly dangerous one. If the second version costs you nothing, and the first one might cost you a little of your own reputation as the man who sent her there in the first place. There's one more small, telling detail I want to leave you with before we move into the aftermath. Knight's diary, the same one Noyce tore pages out of to build his case against Ada, eventually made its way into an academic archive where researchers could finally read it in full, missing pages and all, and compare it directly against Ada's own notebook from the same months. Read side by side, the two accounts don't tell the story Noyce sold to newspapers around the world. They tell the story of a frightened, dying man and an exhausted, grieving woman doing their best for each other under conditions neither of them had ever been prepared for, with all the resentment and tenderness that combination actually produces in real people rather than in the tidy heroes and villains a newspaper headline needs. It took decades for anyone to read it that carefully. I think it's worth remembering that the truth was sitting there in Knight's own handwriting the entire time, waiting for someone to actually bother looking. Chapter 5. The Last Word. Let's take stock carefully of what became of everyone involved in this story, because I think the endings genuinely matter here, and some of them are stranger and sadder than you might expect. Crawford, Maurer, and Gala were never found, not that year, not in any of the searches and expeditions that followed over the following decades. Their families received no bodies and no real closure beyond the simple exhausting confirmation, eventually, that all reasonable searching had finally been abandoned. Crawford's family in Toronto had watched their 20-year-old son leave for what was framed at the time as a prestigious opportunity, handpicked by one of the most famous explorers alive. What they got back instead was silence, and then, slowly, the certainty that the silence would never end. Gallia's family faced the added particular cruelty of knowing their 19-year-old son had gone north as Stephenson's own trusted secretary, someone the great man had personally chosen and vouched for, only to be left, along with two other young men, to walk out onto the sea ice with no one senior enough left in camp to tell them not to. Their names survive today, mostly in expedition rosters and academic footnotes, three young men who followed one famous explorer's untested theory out onto shifting pack ice and simply never came back to tell anyone what they found out there. Lorne Knight is buried, in the loosest possible sense of that word, still on Wrangel Island today, inside the same packing box shelter Ada built carefully around his body because she no longer had the physical strength left to dig him a proper grave. It's a strange, quiet postscript to a man who had once tied the same woman to a flagpole for defiance, and who later depended on her entirely, and without any real reciprocity, for every single day of the last 6 months of his life. Harold Noyce's smear campaign against Ada was, eventually, formally retracted, though he faced remarkably little lasting professional consequence for having spread it as widely and as aggressively as he did in the first place. Vilhjalmur Stephenson's own career continued largely unscathed by any of this. He published The Adventure of Wrangel Island in 1925 and remained a respected, if genuinely controversial, figure within polar exploration circles for years afterward, even as a second party he personally sent to that same island the very next year met an even stranger, and in its own way, even sadder fate. Later in 1923, another American colonist, Charles Wells, along with 12 Inuit settlers, was landed on Wrangel Island in yet another attempt to hold the disputed territorial claim in place. In 1924, the Soviet Union sent an armed icebreaker, the Krasny Oktyabr, and forcibly removed every one of them. Wells himself died of pneumonia in Vladivostok amid the tense diplomatic fallout that followed his arrest. An Inuit child in the same group died as well of tuberculosis during their prolonged detention. The surviving Inuit colonists were left effectively stateless for close to a year afterward, shuttled uncertainly between Soviet custody and a Chinese border post that flatly refused to accept them before the American Red Cross finally funded their long, roundabout journey home. Wrangel Island itself became, and to this day remains, Russian territory. In 1926, the Soviet Union formally established a permanent settlement there, and every single drop of blood spent trying to claim the island for Britain and Canada ultimately changed nothing at all about who would end up holding it, and Ada Blackjack. Ada took what money she was finally given, returned quietly to Nome, and after 2 full years apart, at long last brought Bennett to Seattle for the tuberculosis treatment she had crossed what amounted to an ocean of ice in every possible sense of that phrase to be able to afford him. His health improved steadily under proper care, and I think it's worth sitting just for a moment on how much that single outcome must have meant to her, given everything it had cost. She later had another son, and eventually returned to Alaska for good, where, according to some accounts, she spent time working as a reindeer herder, a quiet, physical, outdoor life that couldn't have been further removed from the newspaper headlines still occasionally invoking her name back in the lower 48. She lived out the rest of her life largely outside the public, spotlight she had never once asked to be pulled into in the first place. She rarely discussed Wrangel Island, even with her own family, and what little we know about her private reflections on the ordeal comes mostly from that single 1924 newspaper interview and from the diary itself, rather than from any deliberate effort on her part to set the record straight. I think that silence tells its own story. A woman who had been publicly accused of murder and cannibalism, who had watched her own words get twisted or ignored by men with far more platform than she ever had, might reasonably have decided that talking about it further simply wasn't worth the cost anymore. She chose instead to just live, quietly and on her own terms, for the next 6 decades. Ada Blackjack died on May 29th, 1983, at the age of 85, in the Pioneer Home, a state-run retirement facility in Palmer, Alaska. She's buried today in Anchorage, and her gravestone carries a single word on it that I think says everything the newspapers of 1923 pointedly refused to: heroin. Now, here's what I want to leave you with, because I genuinely think it's the whole point of telling this particular story at all. Ada Blackjack never chose to become an explorer. She never chose fame, and when fame arrived on her doorstep anyway, entirely uninvited, she actively fled from it at every opportunity. She chose, over and over again, for nearly 2 brutal, unrelenting years, to keep another human being alive, even when he treated her with real cruelty, to keep herself alive, even when despair quietly told her not to bother trying anymore, and to keep believing, through 50 below temperatures and total, crushing isolation, that somewhere far to the south, a small boy was still waiting patiently for his mother to finally come home. What's important here, I think, is that her own story was taken from her almost as thoroughly as her promised wages were. For decades afterward, when people bothered to tell the story of Wrangel Island at all, they told Stephenson's version of it, or they told Noyce's version, and Ada Blackjack existed inside those retellings mostly as a rumor, a suspect, an asterisk buried somewhere in the footnotes of other men's careers. It took Jennifer Niven's patient archival research published in 2003 as Ada Blackjack, a true story of survival in the Arctic, working carefully back through Ada's own words in her own diary, cross-referenced against Knight's surviving pages and the surviving correspondence of everyone else involved, to finally hand this story back to the one person who had actually lived through every single day of it. In the years since, institutions that once had no real place for a story like this, the Anchorage Museum, the National Park Service, Dartmouth's own archives, have all done their part to bring Ada's own words into public view, unfiltered by Noyce's scissors or Stephenson's need for a good story. It's a slow, imperfect kind of justice, arriving a full century late and doing nothing at all for the woman it's actually about, but I think it matters anyway, because it means the next person who goes looking for this story will find Ada's own voice first, rather than the version 2 other men constructed around her silence. I find something quietly powerful in that. A woman who was denied fair credit, denied fair pay, and denied even the basic decency of having her own honest account believed over a stranger's calculated smear campaign, still managed, through nothing more than a small notebook and a battered typewriter left behind on an abandoned island, to have the very last word after all. I think about how many other Adas there probably are, honestly, scattered through the history of exploration and survival more broadly, women and indigenous people whose competence quietly kept famous men's expeditions alive long enough to become famous stories in the first place, with their own names reduced to a footnote or a nickname, or, in the cruelest cases, a rumor. Ada Blackjack got her name back, eventually, because one determined biographer decided her diary was worth taking seriously. I don't think we should assume every story like hers gets that same second chance. Thank you, sincerely, for spending this time with me and with Ada Blackjack. I hope you're well, wherever you are. Goodbye.